Okay, yeah. So Jonathan George retired as a major, served, went to boot camp in 1997, got out in 1998 due to an injury, came back as an officer in 2001, and then served all the way through my retirement in 2023. Um, Extensive deployments. Primarily, what you're probably interested in is obviously OIF. So 2003 in Kuwait, and then the push into Iraq, um, and then from there did a UDP to Okinawa, Japan. I came back, and then did another tour in OIF in 2006. And that was to Fallujah, and then a significant amount of deployments once, I did 8 years in the Indo-PACOM AOR, so extensive deployments within the Indo-PACOM AOR supporting various operations. The last major deployment was supporting Operation Pacific Eagle Philippines and MARSOC down in Zamboanga, and that was in 2020 as commander of the MARDET, the Marine Detachment supporting MARSOC down there.
All right, thank you. So to start off, let's give us a little bit about your background, who you are, where you're from, and what eventually led you to the Yellow Footprints.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, it started as a young kid growing up in the 80s watching Top Gun. I wanted to always be a fighter pilot. Um, but as I started to get myself ready for it, as my vision was not good enough to fly. So soul was crushed. I knew I could not be a pilot. I was a big fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the movies like Commando and Predator and all that, and Heartbreak Ridge and all these other movies. And I really sighted my sights on it. If I could be one of the elite in the military, to me it was the Marine Corps, and that's really what drove me to the Marine Corps. And so, as it was time to graduate high school, I wanted to enlist. My mom's like, "No, you need to go to college first, and then figure out what you want to do." So I did that route. This was back in the early '90s where there was no combat, right? And so it was really difficult to get a commission in the Marine Corps at that time in terms of the competitive nature. Had to have a extremely high GPA and high in PFT at the time. And so when I graduated college, I decided I would enlist. And so I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1997. Stood on the yellow footprints at MCRD San Diego. I had goals and aspirations of being a machine gunner, 0331. And then while I was at Camp Pendleton in training, I was injured, discharged, spent a few years rehabilitating myself, and the extensive, doctors getting letters and all that stuff. I was able to actually gain an offer to go to OCS in 2001.
Tell us a little bit about your injury. What happened?
Yeah, I just, through, boot camp and School of Infantry, the huge pace at SOI, like my feet just gave out, and I could not rehabilitate myself in the Marine Corps, and I just needed extensive, rehabilitation, on my feet, and so that's essentially why I was discharged.
So talk to us a bit again. What was that transition like? Then going from boot camp, discharge, and then back to OCS. Tell us a little bit about. Did you feel more prepared for OCS because you had done boot camp previously? Like, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so they're two different animals, right? I mean, boot camp, they're training, the average kid off the street just to be a Marine. So, everyone's broken down and everyone's built up, right, to be kind of a common thing, which is, earning the title of Marine. And so you're coming from all walks of life. OCS, you're screened before you even get there. So you're making it through that process first. And then you get to OCS and it's a completely different place, right? And for me, boot camp was extremely easy because I was physically fit. I was a college graduate. I spent most of my boot camp on Firewatch. because I didn't go out of the classes, because I could just take the test and I could pass the test without issues. So while most of our platoon was out, doing the first aid class or you name the whatever class it was, I stayed back and did fire watch. And then I would go and I would take the test and I would pass and I'd be I was the second down from honor graduate for boot camp. But knowing what boot camp was and the games are going to be played in terms of the drill instructors and how it's a screening process and it's designed for you to fail and see how you can recover from that. I found OCS to be extremely physically challenging, right? You have to run and you have to run well and you have to PT well and you have to have a high PFT score. So the pull-ups and the crunches and all that were killer. And and you're also being screened to become an officer, right? You're not guaranteed a commission at the end of OCS, right? So that entire process is seeing whether you can hack it and you can lead Marines in combat. And the what I enjoy about my career is I went through OCS and started TBS before 9/11, right? So it was a pre-combat mentality going in through OCS. And to watch as you start a platoon of when you start boot camp, you have a platoon of 70 recruits. All 70 are going to graduate unless someone goes crazy or they get hurt or they get recycled. You're all going to graduate, right? In OCS, you're being screened. And so if you start with 70 guys, I want to say we graduated 38 out of our platoon. And you start to notice that, like, as you look back, you can go on day one of OCS and go, oh, that guy's not going to make it. That guy's not going to make it. That guy's not going to make it. And it was fun to watch as you start with 70 and you slowly see guys just quit. They give up or they get hurt, unfortunately, or they just can't hack it. And so the screening process at OCS works. And so having gone to boot camp and understand kind of what the structure is and what the drill instructors are actually going to do and the purpose and the meaning behind a lot of the exercises or the things, the situations you're being put into, it's all to screen you to see if you can actually lead Marines, and that's the most critical thing. And so from that aspect, it was very challenging, but you knew what the end goal was, and that was to become an officer of Marines.
So, because you had a college degree, then did you go through the OCC program? So you were full 10 weeks.
I was the full 10 weeks. Yes.
So, what my question then is, having gone through boot camp, or at least the enlisted entry-level training, one of the things that we would see the attrition in the PLC program where they did the junior seniors,
yes,
is a lot would not come back to complete seniors. Did you go through any of that sort of culture shock of, oh my God, I've got to go through like entry-level training again? Or were you like, I'm totally gung-ho now on this thing? Like, what was that like? And then what were your thoughts as you're going through it? Like, oh, this is very different from enlisted training, or is like just so what were all of your thoughts going through all of that as you're ascending?
I was, my mind was, holy crap, this is really hard, right? But for me, failure was not an option, right? I was not going to fail. I still had a lot of physical pain going through OCS. My feet hurt, and we were not allowed to take medication. So you couldn't take Advil, you couldn't take a leave, but I kept a leave with me. Like I literally had a leave hidden. And if I was hurting, I would take my leave. And that helped me kind of get through some of the pain. But if you would have gotten caught with a leave, it's an integrity violation, right? As an officer, you have to have integrity, right? But for me, it's I'm going to take that a leave, or I'm going to fail out of something and I'm going to get kicked out. So for me, the choice was obvious. I remember one incident, where we had to wear, the old school, hot weather combat boot, and those things just hurt my feet so bad. And so I remember we're going out to do drill, and I was wearing the old school Danner boots because they were more comfortable and they didn't hurt my feet as much. And so I was the only guy out there in these Danner combat boots, and my drill instructor came up and was screaming at me, berating me while I was out of uniform and blah blah blah. And I told him flat out, I said, I'm either going to wear these boots or I'm going to drop because they hurt my feet. And so I'm going to wear these boots and I'm going to stay in this formation and I'm going to do the drill in these boots. And they left it at that. And so I continued to wear the footwear that I wanted to, that helped me get through OCS.
What about some of the academics? How does that compare to enlisted level, entry level training?
It's college level academics, and so it's I remember boot camp being a lot of multiple choice, really easy questions. OCS was significantly harder. There's a lot writing on it. I think you were allowed one or two failures, and you'd retake a test, but you had academic failures in OCS, guys that were kicked out because they couldn't master the material. And so it was hard. And then you're also going out and you're doing field exercises. You're leading a fire team or a squad into some sort of, mock combat situation, or the leadership reaction course, or some of these other things that have positive or negative outcomes on whether you're going to stay at OCS or not. Especially a lot of the final, exercises. If you fail those things, you're done. Right. So there's a lot riding on that versus boot camp. If you have a pulse and you just do the work, you're going to graduate.
And so where were you then for 9/11? You'd mentioned you were going through a lot of this ascension pre 9/11. Where were you on September 11th?
Yep. So we started TBS in August of 2001. Sorry, I'm trying to remember all my dates. Yes, August of 2001. That's when we started TBS. And so my grandmother had died early September of 2001. So I flew back September 10th back to Minnesota. I flew out of Dulles and flew up to Minnesota for her funeral, which was on September 11th. So I remember waking up on the morning of September 11th, getting ready to go to my grandmother's funeral, and we turn on the TV and you're seeing planes crash into the towers. And so, being in the Marine Corps prior to 9/11, and then all of a sudden seeing like the immediate shift to a combat mindset, even at TBS, it was an immediate like, oh shit, this is actually real. So we went through about a month of academics at TBS where it's just, the basic stuff. And then so for the 2 weeks post 9/11, I was sort of stuck because there was no flights. So I went back home to Colorado, hung out for about 2 weeks before I could get a flight back to TBS. They were very accommodating, understanding that certain people were still stuck. But got back to OCS TBS, I'm sorry, and get plugged back into all the academics. And it was an immediate shift in the mindset, right? It's especially in the instructors. They're like, Marines, this attack just occurred. We don't know where it's going to go, but you need to shift to a combat mindset. And so you can see the academics and everything you were doing was now real. You had something to apply it to. You knew something was going to be on the horizon. And so I think everyone was sort of ratcheted up a little bit in terms of, the meaningfulness of TBS, right?
So talk about a little bit about your lead up to your involvement in OIF in 2003. Obviously we were gearing up for war. What was your experiences like both building up to that as well as then when you get abroad and then preparing to actually do the invasion?
Absolutely. So I MOS, so I entered the Marine Corps as an officer as an 0207, so air intelligence. So post TBS, went to Naval Intelligence Officer Basic course for 6 months. And then my first unit was Marine Aircraft Group 39 out of Camp Pendleton. And so I joined them in October of 2002. So even going through the Naval Intelligence Basic course, it's a shift in a combat mindset, right? So everybody knew, even the naval officers knew something's coming. And so that shaped our instruction, especially in that course. And then once I got to my first unit at Camp Pendleton in October, we started to get, an understanding of what the operational planning was going to be like for a potential invasion of Iraq. We knew things were already, going on with Afghanistan. And we knew that, through the operational planning that we were going to be aligned to the initial invasion of Iraq. And so we knew that in October. We just knew it was just a matter of time. And I think as a young Marine officer, you want to do what you're trained to do. So we were all excited. Like, we are finally going to go and we're going to be able to apply our trade in a combat environment. And so as a young second lieutenant at the MAG S2, as we developed the O plan, I knew that I was going to be a forward intelligence support element. So we knew that as we were leapfrogging from Kuwait into Iraq to where the forward operating bases were, air bases were going to be, my team was going to leapfrog with other teams to provide intelligence support to all of the air combat element, mainly on the helo side. And so that was the training at Camp Pendleton, is doing that training, and what gear do we need and how do we set up and what equipment do we need to support these forward arming and refueling points, and how do we provide those pilots the intelligence they need to do their mission. And so we knew we were going to Iraq. It was all just a matter of when. So we were on a very tight leash up until then, and then we left roughly the 1st of February to fly over to Kuwait. And we were at Aliyah Salem Air Base in Kuwait, setting up operations there. And then I was, I was in charge of essentially the MAG Intelligence Center. They're providing intelligence support to the entire MAG, feeding up into 3rd Mall, the wing, was it Aliyah? No, the other base in Kuwait, which escapes me, Jalaba, I believe. So I worked night shift on that, and my buddy worked day shift. So we just did that until we got word that the invasion was coming, in the next few days. And so, the invasion kicked off. As we waited for forces to push up and we could actually have forward arming and refueling points or forward operating bases, that's when I was sent forward into Iraq, roughly April 4th. The invasion was March 20th. So roughly 2 weeks later is when we got the go to start, crossing into Iraq and set up intelligence operations in Iraq. The first place we operated was an air base called An Numanaya. And so was there for roughly 2 weeks, supporting combat operations as pilots would go off. They would do their combat operations, come back, rearm, refuel. We give them, hey, here's where we think what's going on. Here's what we need to look out for, etc. And they would go out and execute their targets, and then come back, rinse, recycle, repeat on that.
So put us in your shoes a little bit. Like, what did you personally experience? What did you personally see? What was your day-to-day battle rhythm like? Put us specifically into what Jonathan was experiencing.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because now it's like the memories are starting to come out, right? And so, when we were at Aliyah Salem, Kuwait, we were having Scuds launched at us. And so you'd get the siren alert, you'd throw on all of your mop gear, your mop suit, and your gas mask, and you'd go running out to the bunkers. And so there was many days and nights where we'd be sitting in a bunker, and you'd either hear a Scud being shot down by a Patriot, or one would land, somewhere, in the distance, and you'd feel the shockwave and all that. And so that was one of the memories. Also, having worked night shift meant I had to sleep during the day. And so, extremely hot in the desert, trying to sleep during the day with all the sides of the tent rolled up, and you're just laying in a pool of sweat, just trying to get your sleep. And so that's a memorable thing as well. I was also put in charge of assisting with recce, or recognition of military targets. And so training both American pilots and British pilots on what friendly units and equipment look like. And so I frequently would go flying with the Americans or with the Brits to go out and take pictures of American equipment and conduct operations, and then coming back and training the pilots of, this is what an American Amtrak looks like. These are the markings. This is what it looks like under NVGs. This is what it looks like on FLIR. Same thing with the American pilots, is training them. Hey, this is what the Brit vehicles look like. Here's what their uniforms look like. All of these things. That's one of the things that I was put in charge of. And so that was the main thing. And then one of the biggest thing that stood out to me is there was 4 of us officers, 2 second lieutenants and 2 first lieutenants. One of the first lieutenants was selected to roll with ground forces the night of the invasion. And so he was embedded with them. His job was to provide that immediate, air intelligence to, those pilots that were maybe had to land near the invasion forces or overhead. And, the night of the invasion, as they were staged, he started crying, bawling his eyes out, panicking. He said he couldn't do it. And they pulled him. He was immediately pulled out, and he was sent back to the United States. And I never heard from that kid again. And so, the leadership recognized that you can't have an officer like that, acting like that in front of the Marines that are to his left and to his right. And so he was not able to keep himself together, and he was immediately sent home. And so that's one of the enduring memories that I have of the good and the bad, quite honestly.
So walk us through the invasion, and what was again, things that you experienced, things that you witnessed. What stood out? If you have any, what was your assessment of the enemy and their capabilities? How did you think it was progressing for the Marines? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So being an intel officer, right, our job was to have a full understanding of the Iraqi military and their capabilities. And so, it was literally what we called a bean counter chart. And so it was literally every single Iraqi unit. How many pieces of armor do they have? How many pieces of anti-aircraft equipment do they have? And then as the war progressed, as we started to get battle damage assessments, it was crossing off, how many do we think they have left? So it was a very meticulous process. And on paper, it looked like a very formidable foe, right? They had so much equipment. We thought it was going to be a slog, at least initially. And so we were prepared for that fight. Being in Kuwait, we had Oliver North embedded with us at Mag 39. So we saw Oliver North constantly. And throughout the war, he was with Mag 39, and especially as they pushed up. And so lots of stories about Oliver North, maybe as we push along through the timelines of the interview here. But as things started to kick off, March 20th, March 21st, that's when we started getting casualties, right? Especially for the MAG, we had a sea night crash in one of the early movements, and so we lost 4 of our pilots, and however many Marines were on board, probably 12 to 18 Marines on board, all dead. And so that's when it started to become real, like, holy shit, like guys that I saw on a daily basis, briefing them in the ready room are now gone. And that's when it started to hit home, because we weren't losing Marines in at this point in actual combat. We were losing it to aircraft, mishaps, kind of a thing. And I remember vividly, because we had Oliver North with us, they flew out there. I want to say Oliver North might have been in the second airship with that flight. And so Fox News actually recorded it and saw the aftermath. And they came back, and I remember the MAG commanding officer said, "Please do not report on this until we notify the families." And then Oliver North reported it to Fox News, and it was on Fox News, and we're watching it, maybe 5-6 hours after it happened on Fox News, and they hadn't even notified all the families yet. So I remember, Oliver North getting a stern berating from our commanding officer, but I believe he was allowed to stay with us. And so that was the first really memory of any kind of combat losses. And then as Marines started to push north, across the border, is when we actually started to get some actually combat casualties. But again, it seems to be a lot of accidents. So, a Cobra was doing, close air support, and they ran into an unmarked, FM tower, so 300 or 400 foot tower. They ran into that. And so we lost, two very good, Cobra pilots there. We lost a Huey, same type of thing on takeoff, it crashed. And so as I kind of look back on this now, I'm starting to really realize, I don't know if we actually lost in that early stages of combat. I don't know if we actually lost aircraft to enemy fire. It was just mishaps, quite honestly.
So you said you were in Numantia for a while. Yeah. Did you displace from Numantia once the movement kept going north, or where did you stay there throughout?
Yeah. So I had the short pass for OAF 1. So I was identified to go support HMLA 369 for their Okinawa UDP. And so I was in Iraq for about 3 weeks before they pulled me back to Kuwait. So I actually flew back to Camp Pendleton in May of 2003 to join HMLA 369 to go on their Okinawa deployment. So I got the very short version of Iraq. And so roughly February through May. But in that short, 3 to 4 months, I got to experience the full width and breadth and depth of combat operations, and being able to do my job and see the results. Be able to lead those Marines in those situations, and so that was very rewarding. One of my favorite memories from on Numantia is there was a Cobra flying north of Iraq. And it was blowing up a arms depot at an airfield up there, and they were flying overhead, and they were shooting their rockets and guns. And as the Cobra flew over that ordnance, the ordnance detonated. Right, so flamed out both the engines, and that Cobra crashed at that airfield. Both pilots survived. They got out, and they were evac'd, but I was tasked with leading a trap mission, so tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel. So I was a young second lieutenant leading a group of 12 to 15 EOD Marines to go out and strip the aircraft of anything valuable or worthwhile, and then destroy the aircraft. The most interesting thing of this story is my senior enlisted, who was just put into this with me, was an EOD Marine who also happened to be my drill instructor from boot camp. And so there I was in combat operations in Iraq with, a guy that was a sergeant at the time when I was in boot camp and now was a gunnery sergeant. And I'm leading my drill instructor to go out and secure this airfield. They strip all the parts off this aircraft, and then we strap 100 pounds of C4 to it and then blow this aircraft up. And so coincidentally, we do have video of all of that, and the blowing up or the reduction of the Cobra as well. But very just interesting to be on a mission with your drill instructor for boot camp.
What were your thoughts about being sent to Okinawa? Did you feel like you were being taken away from your mission? Were you disappointed? And then tell us about the transition experience going from combat operations in Iraq to then now you're in around Japan, Okinawa.
Yeah, I wish I could remember how I felt. So I did keep a journal, which I did not read before this. I probably should have read it just so I could refresh my memory of what I was thinking. I feel like I probably would have been okay with it because we had sort of culminated in Iraq, right? By the time I was leaving Iraq and Kuwait, Baghdad, I think I want to say Baghdad had already fallen. Saddam Hussein was in hiding, and it was sort of like a mission accomplished kind of a thing. And so for me, it was like I got there, I got the check in the box, I was able to do my job, I did all those things, and okay, now it's time to go on and do because every air intel officer, their goal is to be a squadron intelligence officer, right? And so for me, just being able to go to a Huey Cobra squadron and actually support that as the squadron S2 doing my job, I think that was probably like, okay, I've got this next goal to go and attain. And so, yeah, I went back to Camp Pendleton. Obviously I was only gone 3 to 4 months. So it was, coming back, to Camp Pendleton to where I lived on Camp Pendleton was called Ferrari Court. We called it Fraternity Court or Fertility Court because it was all second lieutenants and first lieutenants unmarried without kids, right? And so everybody either got pregnant or partied all the time on this. And so, but as you come back, I was one of the very few husbands home on Camp Pendleton, quite honestly, in a lot of housing. So I felt fortunate, but I also got to see the bad side of that when, your neighbor, 3 houses down, her husband was killed one night. And so you're out in the street and the wives are trying to console, the husband who just found out, or the wife that just found out her husband was killed, right? And so you feel like you're the guy who's like not doing his job because everyone else is overseas, but you're home. And so, being in Iraq and seeing it and then coming home and seeing how all this stuff kind of plays out and the aftermath of combat and the results of combat, you see it firsthand. So that was hard. But then with the squadron, same thing, doing workups and training, and then, deployed to Okinawa, Japan in roughly October of 2003 for a 7-month, UDP or unit deployment program to Okinawa. And so that was great, supporting multiple exercises, Balakatan in the Philippines, Ulchi Freedom Guardian, UFG in Korea, and I'm sure there's one more I'm forgetting, but that was a really good experience, being able to be the squadron intelligence officer, train for these exercises, go out to an exercise, even though it's not combat, right? But there's a scenario, right? You get to brief the intelligence to the pilots and where the targets are at, and they go out and they kill the targets, and then you go through the whole intelligence process. And so learning how to do my job in those situations was absolutely a worthwhile experience as well.
So I want to go back just a little bit. So you had mentioned, and I think for all of us in this generation, we all remember mission accomplishment or mission accomplished. So when you said that, it totally,
yes,
it's very triggering. With
it is, and having lived through 20 years of combat, now I go back and I go, what the fuck were we doing? Like, and I even go back and it's like, was it worth it? It's like, no.
Yeah, that banner's got to be somewhere in some museum somewhere that we should have all of us sign it. But anyhow, so you're heading back to Oki. I guess I'll just share a little bit of my experience as I make this question way too long. Is when I was leaving Iraq, I was thinking, hey, we're going to be the guys who had the combat action ribbons. We're going to be the big dogs, back in garrison. Did you have those same thoughts going into Oki? And then what were some of your thoughts as you're in Okinawa, you're in Camp Pendleton, and the war isn't ending the way we thought it was going to? Yeah.
So, I went to Iraq and I came back with 7 ribbons and medals, right? For 4 months of participation in Iraq, 7 ribbons. And so you're just like, holy cow, just for doing all these things, the President Unit Citation, the Naval Unit Citation, the Meritorious Unit Citation, a NAM, like all these things. You're like, holy cow. Like, when I joined the Marine Corps, I had 2 shooting badges, right? And all of a sudden now you feel like you're a war hero, right? And then, but, the majority of the squadron that I was with, that I joined, about 1/3 of them had supported combat operations in Iraq, whether they were on the MEU or whatever it was. So there were some, but I was one of the few guys that actually had, the most recent Iraq or combat experience. And so I was able to at least provide that sort of color commentary as an intel guy, like, hey, I know this is a different AOR, but this is how we're seeing, this equipment, implemented or used, and helping train those pilots on the Recce project that I did in terms of recognition of enemy vehicles. And so, I remember hosting game shows in the ready room, and doing tanks for 100, Alex, and the pilots would do the game show and they'd have to figure out what kind of plane that is or what kind of tank it is. And so all of those experiences, like all the pieces were starting to come together from the combat experience as I sort of grew and progressed throughout my career. Everything builds, right? And so I could see the building blocks progress as I sort of moved up the ranks and through my different units.
So work us through your deployment to Okinawa, and how did that go? And then to what extent were you aware of what was going on in Iraq as the war transitioned from conventional to non-conventional? And then tell us a little bit then about how you ended up back in there in 2006.
Yeah, so I think we all felt a little sad that we weren't there in combat. Okinawa was a tropical island, and we're all able to go out and have fun and drink and do all those things, and almost take a break from it. But I remember getting a phone call, from my wife, whatever time o'clock in the morning in December, whenever that was, when Saddam Hussein was captured. So I remember my wife, and so we all thought like, oh, cool, it's over, right? They got him. We're transitioning, and then obviously we know how that all kind of played out. But for me, it was, at the time, we had access to the website that lists all the casualties. So on a daily basis, you're going to this website and you're clicking refresh and you're looking for like, oh shit, Army, and then you see Marines, you're like, oh shit, I know that guy. Or I went to OCS or TBS with that officer, or so and so is dead, or some of the Marines that stayed back and went on mobile training teams or police training teams or whatever, you name it. You started to hear guys as it went from conventional to unconventional. You're like, I just heard so and so got blown up by an IED. It's like, holy shit! I just talked to him 2 weeks ago on email, or I just saw him. And so you start to see the casualties start to grow. And then you start to hear about more aircraft being now shot down or other things happening. I remember, just because we're on that subject, roughly 2007 or whatever it was, as you go through the list and you see a name on that list that a pilot from HMLA 369 that I was in, awesome dude, Major Bloomfield, guy had 5 kids, and you see his name on the list. And at the time, we also had access to a lot of these places where people uploaded videos from Iraq, like the civilians, like almost like the dark web kind of a thing. And you're seeing videos of Major Bloomfield dead in his helicopter, and they're beating him with a shoe, and they're pulling on him, and they're pulling stuff off, and you see someone pulling off his wedding ring on this video, uploaded to the internet. And so it really starts to become real when you see that transition, and then you're actually seeing videos of people dead, being beaten with shoes and pulled out of helicopters and all that stuff. So that's when it started to become a lot more real, and we knew that this was transitioning into something a lot different. I'll pause there for questions, and I know you said you wanted to go back to second tour to Iraq.
Yeah, so again, give us sort of like your day-to-day experiences in Okinawa,
Yep.
and then you've touched on sort of the war in the background, and then how did you end up back there?
Yeah, so obviously we did mostly supporting exercises in Okinawa. So it was a a 7:30 to 16:30 kind of a job, right? You show up, you do your job, the pilots are doing daily flight operations. If they're supporting training on Okinawa, or they're supporting the MEU, or we were deploying to, like I said, we went down to the Philippines for Balikatan for a month, and then to Korea for UFG, or it might have even been Keen Edge or Keen Sword, for for Korea. But those were all good, having never been to Asia. And so for us, the squadron, we were loaded on the HSV, high speed vessel. It's this dual, basically a giant catamaran where you can load actually helicopters in the belly, and then all of us are loaded in like stadium seating on the main deck. And so you're driving those down to the Philippines with all your gear and helicopters aboard to support that. And then same thing in Korea. And it really, I would like to say that there was, awesome, exciting things that came out of it, but it's just, a young, fresh officer, being in these new foreign countries, and being away from home and the wife, and you're just able to go and do your job without any distractions, support these exercises, for a couple weeks, and then you pack up and you go home. I wish I would say that there was, a lot of exciting, cool things that came out of it, but it really was just, a 6 to 7 month deployment in a non-combat environment, right? So came back, and then from there I went to the backup. I was pulled back up to the MAG to be the assistant MAG S2. Did a bunch of different trainings to get myself ready to transition to my next unit. For me, I knew that I wanted to transition out of air intel. It was great, but I wanted to go support ground forces, right? I wanted to be in the infantry. I wanted to be in reconnaissance. So looking at the list of all of the available billets, there was nothing that really excited me. It was a regimental S2, it was, some other things. And so what I did is I called around to the 3 different recon battalions, and I'm like, are you hiring? No. So I called all of them. I called 2nd Recon Battalion in Camp Lejeune, talked to the XO. I'm like, hey, are you hiring? I really want to go there. He's like, no, I'm sorry. We've got a guy already. So I waited about a week or two, and then the Recon XO calls me up and says, hey, are you still interested? And I said, well, fuck yeah, I am. And so he worked with the monitor, and I got orders to the unit that I wanted to go, which was 2nd Recon Battalion. So I got all my training in place. I did my SEER school, and I went to our what we call MAGTF Intel Officer course back at Dam Neck, Virginia. That transitions us from our specialty Intel courses or background, and that makes us basically a generalist, MAGTF Intel Officer. So did that in Virginia Beach, and then went down to join 2nd Recon at Camp Lejeune in 2005. And then we knew we were on the docket to go into Iraq in 2006. So of course, all of the training, everything was now a counterinsurgency mindset, right? It wasn't a traditional combat operations. And so all of the training we did, transitioning from aircraft recognition and tanks and all this stuff to no shit, these are Marines at the tip of the spear in combat. And I am being able to do the job that I was trained to do to support those Marines. And so that's when the job really became real for me, because you don't want to let those guys down, right? And so every aspect of the training and our daily battle rhythm of my intel section as the Recon S2 was training my Marines for combat, and then also making sure those Recon Marines, were ready, to receive the best intel support that they could possibly get from us. So I think we deployed roughly February or March of 2006. We were in Fallujah, Camp Fallujah. Our battle space was the Zidon, which was essentially southeast of Camp Fallujah. And so, yeah, our job was, reconnaissance doesn't typically own battle space, but because of the sheer amount of battle space, in and around Iraq, we actually had battle space. And so, roughly one or two companies, were providing the combat support in the Zidon, and then another company in reserve, for a quick reaction force, or to be able to go and support, raids and other direct action missions, in and around Fallujah. And so that's really, that tour was the most rewarding tour I've ever had. There's been nothing like it. I was able to do my job as an intel officer, supporting real combat operations and driving combat operations, and being able to brief the OPSO and the CO and say, hey, we've got this amount of intel that says that there's an IED factory, or there's a foreign fighter, or whatever it is in Camp Fallujah, or not in Camp Fallujah, sorry, in the Zidane, and be able to say, hey, we need to go and check this out. And then to be able to go and do a raid or any other kind of operation, and then be able to see the fruits of your labors, right? They go there, it may have been a dry hole sometimes, but other times, they run into foreign fighters, or they run into an IED factory, and they run all, they find all the components, and then doing the exploitation on that stuff and seeing if you can pull more information from the locals to be able to go and develop other targets. That was really rewarding. Also the most difficult deployment, because we had casualties. We had a lot of casualties. We had a Humvee of 5 Marines, hit an IED, and all 5 of those Marines were killed. I think 1 instantly, and then the other 4 were burned horrifically and ended up either dying at Landstuhl or going back to the U.S. and dying back in the U.S. And so that's when it really became real. And then you have other Marines, killed in combat, in combat operations. I still carry a lot of emotional weight, because, like one of them was, there's a foreign fighter group at this compound here. We've got 4 or 5 corroborating sources. We've got UAVs. We've got all these things. They're there. And the Marines go there, and they start kicking in doors. And we lost, one of our corpsmen, who I saw on a daily basis, was one of the leading guys kicking in doors, clearing this compound, and he took rounds right to the face. And so, HM1 Deal, died, there. And so after the fact, and all of the insurgents, had pulled back into a concrete bunker, a concrete house. I've got my UAV circling overhead, and then they just level, an F-16 just levels this house with a JDAM, kills everybody inside, men and women, children, doesn't matter. Whole compound was leveled. And so then, driving out there, maybe 12 hours later with my CO and our XO and our sergeant major to go to the scene, and the Marines had already been pulled out, right? But seeing the insurgents' bodies blown apart, body parts everywhere, torsos, etc. That was the first time I'd actually seen that stuff. So it was a very visceral reaction to be like, holy shit, I'm in an up armored Humvee, we're driving through like this rubble, and you're like, there's an insurgent there, and he's got no arms and no legs, and his head's 2 feet from him. Having seen that for the first time, it was very eye-opening, right? You see it firsthand, and you also experience the losses firsthand. We had multiple casualties. I remember Bixler, was walking in front of a Humvee clearing mines, and Bixler himself stepped on a landmine. And so, that QRF, he was a first lieutenant friend of mine who was in charge of that quick reaction force, or provisional rifle platoon, out clearing roads. He watched, Lance Corporal Bixler, vaporize in front of his eyes, right? Just gone. And so these are all Marines that right? And so it became, in my first, experience in Iraq in 2003, you're separated from all of that, right? You're like, oh, so-and-so died. You're like, oh shit, that sucks, right? And then you see Major Bloomfield being pulled dead out of a helicopter, right? And then you're in Iraq, you're now experiencing it firsthand with the Marines that you see to the left and to your right. And then you're hearing it firsthand from your friends. My buddy who was the provisional rifle platoon commander, watching Bixler get, die. And you're seeing their reactions. And it was difficult, because these young officers are now writing letters home to their parents. And they're like, what do I say? I don't know what to say. At the time, it was First Lieutenant Waller. I think he might be captain at the time as well. But, he had to write that letter home to those 5 Marines that were killed in the Humvee IED explosion. And his letter, you'll still see it circulating on Facebook and a few other places, of this letter that he had to write home to his parents. And it's like a 1 or 2 page letter home. Like his words, it really starts to set in terms of the legacy and the lives that these Marines led, and what they died for, you know, he did a really good job of really kind of capturing what we all felt, in that letter home to those families. Um, we had other Marines that just, they just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and they get shot. Um, and I remember, we had one Marine that was on a rooftop, sitting there eating chow, and he sneezed. And right as he sneezed, a bullet punctured his ear and hit the wall right behind him. And so this tall, lanky kid comes back to Camp Fallujah, and he's got his ear taped up, and he hands our commanding officer the bullet that almost killed him. And I remember my commanding officer, kept that, on his desk, and he probably still has it to this day, of that one kid that just got lucky by turning his head at the right moment. Any questions on Iraq? And there's a whole much more for Fallujah, certainly.
No, absolutely. Let's break down a couple of things. So
Yeah.
First off, describe your understanding of the enemy and their capabilities, and also just your personal visceral reaction to them, and how you viewed and perceived them, as well as, on top of that, the locals in the area as well.
Yes, so we knew that we had turned to an insurgency, right? And at the time, the internet was flooded with videos of, beheadings of soldiers or of civilians, how they were treating captured, service members, especially the influx of foreign fighters coming in. We at the time, and it was Al Qaeda. And so for us, they were the enemy, right? I don't necessarily know if in our mind, it wasn't about freeing Iraq. I don't think we really cared that, we're doing this for Iraq. It was, we've gone in there, we kicked open a hornet's nest, right? But we're there to do our job and maintain this, this piece of battle space, and whoever gets in our way, they're not going to survive. And so whether it was, foreign fighters, or it was, Al Qaeda, or as any just in general insurgents, they were not going to stand in our way. As I reflect back on that, and I try to explain to people the insurgent mindset, right? So if someone came into your hometown right now, a foreign force, Russians, Chechens, Cubans, whoever it is, Red Dawn kind of a thing, what would you do, right? Would you open them with open arms, welcome them with open arms? Meanwhile, they're eating your food, they're doing all these things. It's like, a lot of times after the fact, you almost have to at least commiserate with them, or at least feel for them a little bit of, you're an invader in their land, right? And as you look back now and you reflect, you're like, well, yeah, we were outsiders. Did we actually free them from anything? Saddam Hussein, ruled with an iron fist, but there was no insurgency, there was no IEDs, there was none of these things were going on, right? It was, again, it's opinion, but George Bush Sr. wasn't able to do the job in the first Gulf War, so here comes George Jr. to come in and I'm going to remove Saddam Hussein, and we kicked open a hornet's nest. And so I think a lot of it was Al Qaeda exploiting an opportunity to go in and go after U.S. forces, but a lot of it's also foreigners on Iraqi soil. So my point to that is yes, going out on patrol. I went out on patrol a lot with the Marines. That's the only way an intel officer is really going to get a true understanding of the battle space and of the people and the culture. And so yes, going on all these missions, knocking on doors. We call it knock and talk. Knocking on doors, just talking to people. Have you seen anything? Blah blah blah. No, gathering intelligence. And a lot of times having to set up a forward operating base. And so you're taking a family and you're pushing them out of their property or into another building, and the Marines are taking over their house and living in their house for a week or two at a time, and setting up razor wire, all of these things. And then you're living in some Iraqi's house, and then you pull out and you go somewhere else, and you come to find out foreign fighters or Al Qaeda came in and killed the entire family because they thought that they were ratting us out. And so then nobody wants to open their doors to us, and nobody wants to let us in. And so it's all these insurgency things that we learned throughout time that we continue to relearn every time we go somewhere else, right? But a lot of great opportunities. The Iraqis we talked to were very peace loving. The wives and the families and the kids were all great. I had lots of great interactions with Iraqi kids. I remember one time we had these what's called a Dragon Eye UAV, and it's an unmanned vehicle or unmanned plane, roughly 6 foot wingspan and a fuselage, but it has a camera, and you launch it with a giant slingshot. And it goes and it flies around and it does its thing. And one day, we had one that crashed, roughly about a $25,000 piece of equipment. And I told my CO that, hey, this thing crashed. What do you want to do? And he goes, you crashed it, you go get it. And so there was a young, rather first lieutenant or captain at the time, having to go into this village with a couple Marines and be like, have you seen this plane? Have you seen this plane? And eventually they start like bringing you back pieces. And it's like, okay, who has my plane? And so I remember I've got pictures of me paying this Iraqi kid $5 to bring me this fuselage and a camera section from this Dragon Eye UAV. And I'm handing him $5. What does a kid can do with $5? $5 US, probably not much. And probably doesn't want to get caught with it, right? But all those interactions were great. They were happy to help sometimes, and other times they didn't want to help because they thought they were going to be killed.
Can you tell me a little bit about any personal interactions you would have had maybe on patrol when you maybe first initially experienced the enemy, whether that be an IED or some sort of more complex situation?
Yeah. So I actually went advance party into Iraq. So the 10 or 15 of us that went forward, into Iraq first to get sort of things set up, and so we were there to relieve 1st Recon Battalion. And so I was there on Advon before my unit even showed up, and I went out with 1st Recon, and I was in a forward operating base when our forward operating base was attacked. And being able to actually fire your weapon for the first time in combat was exhilarating. It wasn't close quarters. I didn't have insurgents 10 feet from me. It was at a distance, but it was like you could hear the snap and the crack of rounds passing past your position, and at that point you're like, oh shit, this is real, right? That was my first combat experience. Was shit, this is real. And so very anticlimactic story, but that was the first time being able to discharge a weapon in combat and kind of get to understand or feel what that was like. And then I actually was in an IED blast in outside of Fallujah. IED detonated right in front of our vehicle. Everyone was good. Damage to our vehicle. The platoon commander that I was riding with in the vehicle in front of us, he had a concussion, and we all had some sort of concussion, but he basically was sent home because of the effects of that IED blast. But that's one of those ones where it detonated in between 2 vehicles, right? And so that's when you start to go, well, shit. If it was a second earlier or a second later, it would have taken out either his vehicle or my vehicle. And so that's just one of those points where it's just like, wrong time or right place, wrong time kind of thing, where your life could have been drastically changed in the blink of an eye, right? And those are the 2 like really main things. Other than that, it's distant combat operations kind of a thing, or seeing things as we have UAVs circling overhead, you're seeing Marines in combat, or you're seeing mortars fire, or you're doing those kind of things. So.
Did you ever personally interact with any captured insurgent or witness one? Or
Yes, we brought detainees back a lot. Human exploitation teams, so the HUMINT guys were very hard to come by in Camp Fallujah. They were spread extremely thin, and because I had a background in civilian interrogation, I would, even though we weren't allowed to, I was doing at least discussions or talking with detainees through a translator, trying to get information. So there's certain lines where we cannot cross as not a credentialed human intelligence Marine, but at least questioning, right, tactical questioning, in terms to get information. So yes, because there was a jail or a detention facility on Camp Fallujah, we would bring back detainees, we would question, get what we can, and then they would go over to the detention facility where the HET teams would actually do the exploitation and create their reports. But I remember, as they would come back, I would start to talk to them. And I remember my CEO came out to me one day and he said, "You need to pick your job. You're either a HET Marine or a human Marine, or you're my intel officer." He's like, "You need to pick one." So it's like, okay, I will go and I will do because I'm there to support the battalion, right? Not necessarily to question detainees. But for us at the time, it was because the human guys were spread so thin. In order to get immediately relevant tactical information from these guys, it was like you had to talk to them. You had to. And so it was a struggle, trying to get the timely information that we needed. But they would just go to the detention facility and eventually be interrogated, and they'd be processed, and we'd hear a couple days later, what they found. So,
did you find, excuse me, that like you'd mentioned, so you as a recon element, you're owning battle space like a Marine rifle battalion, company, etc. Did you find that the recon mindset started to shift a little bit to become more like a traditional infantry unit? And that was some of the things that seems like you're filling an ad hoc role in a unit that's filling an ad hoc role, but yet everyone's sort of becoming your sort of traditional infantry unit. Like, what were some of the dynamics you were seeing in that?
yes. It didn't set well with any of the recon Marines. Not a single person did it set well with. Even the CO. It's like, these are recon Marines, right? They're trained to go kick in doors. They're trained to go do reconnaissance and hide sites. They're trained to do those things, right? And then in Iraq, you're not. But every Marine a rifleman, right? So we all had to do our part. And if it's battle space, it's battle space. So you see, as recon Marines, and especially our CO, who was labeled a cowboy, one of the greatest Americans I've ever known, Lieutenant Colonel James Bright, retired as a colonel. I just ran into him in Tampa roughly six months ago. First time I had seen him since Iraq, and it was one of the greatest things that I've ever needed to do in my life. Was post combat experience, is run into James Bright at a bar in Tampa and just be able to sit and just unload and talk. And yeah, so I digress, but on that real quick is for him and I just to be able to sit and talk about our casualties and how hard that deployment was. And for me to be able to express my gratitude for his leadership and all of these things and how we both agreed that that was one of the best deployments that we did in our entire lives, but it was also one of the hardest. So to be able to share, have a drink with your old CO from that time was, I texted my wife after the fact. I was like, I needed that just to be able to sit and talk to him and be able to express all of those feelings that you've been holding in for 19 plus years, and to build just a little bit of closure on that. So that was James Bright, the CO, but he was labeled a cowboy, right? Because you're recon. So it was like I remember we went in just like balls to the wall into the Zidon, and like we're gonna go kick in doors, we're gonna talk to people, we're gonna do all these things. And one of the first major casualties we had of just rolling into the Zidon was that Humvee that hit an IED and killed all 5 Marines, right? Loaded to the brim with diesel fuel, and it just in a massive fireball. And so that's when we started they started to throttle back. It's like we can't do this. We are now owning battle space, right? It's an insurgency. You have to manage the population. You have to build rapport. You have to go meet with the villagers or the town sheikh. You got to do all of these things to start to build your own battle space and get an understanding of your battle space by just rolling in like cowboys and kicking in doors and blowing things up, right? And so being able to sit side by side with my CO and my XO, my sergeant major, my OPSO, and go on, all these engagements with the town sheikh, or going to the local mosque, or you're going and sitting, having chai with, the village elder, and start to build those relationships. But it felt like you're just going through the motions, right? Because you're there for 6 to 7 months. They all know you're gone. The new guy's going to come in. He's going to ask the same questions over and over again. We didn't do a very good job of collecting lessons learned. And then it's rinse and repeat. Just do it all over again. So.
So, what was your assessment of? Did you feel like y'all were accomplishing your mission well? Did you feel like things were getting better, or what did you feel like it was a waste of time? And then describe what it was like to then, uh, how long we were in Iraq, and then what was your thoughts upon leaving after that 2006 tour?
Yeah, so there was no mission accomplishment. There was no, if you do this, we're done, right? You're there for the duration. So it was just you just need to manage your battle space. There was no finish line. And so your goal was to get all your Marines out alive and home safe to their friends and family and loved ones and all that. That was your goal. Um, we knew we weren't there and we weren't gonna change anything. Our goal was to keep the insurgency at bay in that piece of battle space. And so, do I feel like it's whack-a-mole? Do we feel like we were successful? Well, sure, in our battle space, in this one village, we whack-a-mole and they're going to pop up in another piece of battle space, or they're going to go somewhere else because the heat is too hot in the Zidon. And then they're going to wait until a new unit comes in and then they'll feel it out and then they'll blow up a couple vehicles. And so it's just like a shifting of chess pieces around a board, or it's almost like checkers. Right? It's how many of them how many of them are you going to kill versus how many of us, are we going to kill? Or if you're starting to keep score at all. Um, and so it was like there was no we won, right? It's just we handed the battle space over to third recon. Here's what you do, and here's the battle space, and you hope that you had prepared the battle space and turned over enough intelligence to them where they could continue to serve, or further develop that battle space. And so for us, we had a top 10 kill capture list. I had my top guy, or top two or three guys on my list that we were never able to actually capture. But after the fact, you hear that they were either killed or captured somewhere else outside your battle space in Iraq. So getting a little bit of closure on some of that post, Iraq once we left was good. But we went back to Camp Lejeune and we started training again, knowing that we would be back in 12 to 18 months again. So again, it's just the cycle of the Iraq or Afghanistan deployments. So.
And something we haven't touched on much yet is what was family life? What was their experiences? What was your relationship with your family during this tour?
Yeah, so I got married in 2002. So I had been married 4 or 5 years at the time. So having already had 2 deployments under my belt, Iraq the first time in the UDP, we were sort of used to it. Didn't have kids at the time, and so my wife was just plugging away at work, in Irvine, Los Angeles area. So she's just driving back and forth to work. So I think that separated her mindset certainly from where I was. But this is when we have email now, right? And I had a Thuraya sat phone, so I was able to email my wife constantly, and I was able to call her, pretty much whenever I could or whenever I wanted to. So it wasn't like back in World War II where you went away and you didn't hear from your spouse for 2 years, kind of a thing, right? We had ways to communicate. So.
And then what was it like then? Because you kind of mentioned World War II. Part of World War II coming home was you would have take weeks to get home. You have the ship, but in the GWAT area, it was a plane ride. Was there any difficulties getting back into living in the States again after having been in a war zone for a few months?
No, it was extremely easy. It was great to come home. You come to Camp Pendleton, you've got you come up on the buses and there's all the, the waving flags and the banners and all the kids running to grab their parents and all that stuff, or, squeeze on dad and all that stuff. And so that was fun to see in terms of, what it's like for a homecoming. But no, it was a pretty easy transition, right? Because I want to go get Taco Bell, right? I knew Van Halen was coming in concert, and so like in 2 weeks, I was so excited because I want to come home from Iraq and go see Van Halen up in LA, in those 2 weeks. And so, no, it was great to come home. I said Camp Pendleton, didn't I? Camp Lejeune, to be able to go home and just get reacclimated with all of those things that you missed. concerts and food and all that. So it was not hard transitioning, right? A little bit of reality sets in, right, when you come home and you're missing, 7 or 8 of the guys that you went over there with, right? Um, but that helps shape the mindset, because now those Marines know, well, shit, it was real. And so now, as we start training and ramping up for our next deployment to go back to Iraq, now we know what we need to really start to focus on and train for. Are we going to have battle space again, or are we going to transition back into our reconnaissance role?
So describe what the Marine Corps did with you next, and any experiences you had until you retired.
Yeah, absolutely. So just in a nutshell is, as we're looking at another deployment to Iraq, I decided it was time to leave. So I actually resigned my commission in 2008 because my wife was pregnant and I was going to miss the birth of my first child. I was like, you know what? I need to take a break. I'm done. So I actually transitioned out. I went to the reserves for 2.5 years. Did some reserve time supporting different intelligence missions, and then came back on active duty in 2010. 2010 was our expeditionary warfare school, and then I worked at Headquarters Marine Corps for 2 years, working in revamping what we do for transition for Marines. And so it was a very, very administrative job. So it was difficult as an intel guy with combat going on, doing an administrative role at Camp Pendleton. But again, the Marine Corps, you have guys in the front line, you have guys in combat, guys and gals, but there's always people that have to be back behind the scenes doing all of this other administrative work to make sure the organization continues to run. So that's how I really justified sort of like almost like giving back to the Marine Corps, is despite me just like despising the fact I was sitting behind a desk every day not doing intel, still being able to affect change for transitioning Marines. So I'm just trying to get fast forwarded to probably the more interesting stuff. But yeah, so from there was selected. Sorry, got orders to Okinawa. So with my family to Okinawa from 2013. So I was at 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in Okinawa with my family. At that point, I finally had 3 kids and a wife, and we just decided, you know what, let's go do something new, and took the whole family back to Okinawa. Had a phenomenal time in Okinawa. Being able to go out and explore and do all the travels and support all the different exercises in Okinawa, working in the MEF G2. The earthquake in Nepal, and so being able to could go do like humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and support to that mission for Nepal was good. One of the biggest things I remember from that is the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing lost a Huey in there, and so it was a fully loaded helo with the Marines, and then I want to say 12 Nepalese civilians, and it crashed into the side of a mountain in rough weather. And knowing one of the Marines on that aircraft, having sat next to him on a C-130 home from Korea, just 2 weeks prior, and you're like, holy shit, Lance Corporal Hug was just killed in a helo crash. He was a PAO Marine. And you're like, holy shit, or combat camera. And you're like, holy shit. It's like you're just flying, you're doing humanitarian assistance, and you're crashing a helicopter. And it's just how all these things go throughout the Marine Corps, right? It's just shit happens, right? And it's unfortunate. So in 2015, so at that point I had pinned on major. I got selected for command in Hawaii. So I actually left Okinawa 1 year early in 2015. And went on to Marine Cryptologic Support Battalion, supporting the NSA mission in Hawaii. So essentially, it's company command, but roughly 90 Marines in Hawaii, supporting both the NSA mission in Hawaii, but also outstations in Korea, Thailand, and Australia. So I call that one the best worst job I ever had, because you're a commander of Marines, right? It's like what every officer wants to do, and to be able to do that mission and to be able to support and do all these things that goes along with command, and then just having the absolute worst commanding officer I've ever had in my entire life as the guy you got to work for. And so that made it extremely difficult, right? So recon was awesome because it was like, I love my boss. It was great. You're in combat, and then you're finally in command. You're like, well, shit, it's great, but it's not great. And so that was a really hard, it was a tough pill to swallow because regardless of where you're at in your career and what position you're in, you have to learn to work with everybody, right? You may not like them, you may love them, they may be a horrible leader, they may be a great leader, but you have to learn to, that's where I learned a lot of in my career. I learned from that experience in terms of, how do you interact with people and your commanding officer, and whether or not you like them or not, it doesn't really matter. It's all about mission accomplishment, right? So that was a fun experience. And then went to Marfor PAC for a year, working in the G2 and helping them establish electronic warfare capabilities. That's when I wrote my first Gazette article. I've written 5 now, but that's where I wrote the first one in terms of what we're doing with Marine Corps electronic warfare. And then from there, went back to Okinawa. So another 3-year tour in Okinawa, but this time I was good, and we went to be the 4th Marines S2. So finally transitioned to ground intel, doing, with recon, and to be able to go to a regiment, an infantry regiment, and be the regimental S2 again was a very rewarding job. Great leadership throughout the entire organization, and just going and training and doing all of those things that an infantry regiment is supposed to do, supporting and training all of the UDP infantry battalions that come through, supporting numerous exercises, being able to go, deploy aboard the USS Wasp and do a float, as the MAGTF S2 for me was very rewarding, for a large combat organization, even being a regimental S2 as a major, being able to be the MAGTF S2 to go down to Bala-Katan and support, mock, combat operations during exercise Bala-Katan was awesome. So that's like a mini MEU deployment for me because I was able to go on the Wasp, experience like the MEU lifestyle for, all of a week, right? But be able to, fly off the MEU on Ospreys and go land, and then, transition from land aboard an LCAC or hovercraft back aboard the Wasp, as you retrograde. And so I really look back as even though it was a very short, 2-week exercise, just to get all of the experiences of being a MEU S2, which is what a lot of intel officers aspire to be, to get that in sort of like a 2-week, quick package was awesome as well.
Were you just at this point decided that you just wanted to be, a career Marine? Like, at what point did you feel like you were wanted to leave the service?
Well, remember, so when we're talking about retirement,
yes,
yeah, I was tired of moving my kids. So my kids had never, we'd never been in one place longer than 3 years. And so as my son was getting ready to enter high school, post Okinawa, that's when we said, you know what, this last move is going to be our last move. And so, we really wanted to go to Germany, but it's like, you know what, we'd have to move again. And so we decided upon going to Marfor Cyber out of Fort Meade, Maryland. And we decided, you know what, this is going to be our last duty station, and we're going to retire. So did the 3 years at Marfor Cyber, and then decided to retire out of Fort Meade. And then now my kids are stable. We've been in one place for 5 years now. So all my kids will go to the same high school, and we have the stability that we need. So
looking back now, the war in Iraq has gone its course. Afghanistan ended how it ended. How do you look back and reflect upon both American involvement in both of those conflicts, particularly the one that you were involved in Iraq? And then second of all, how do you look upon your role in it specifically? How do you reflect upon it?
Yeah, it's easy to go back in hindsight, right? When you're leading up to it and all the rhetoric and, saber rattling, and it's like, excited to go off to war and be able to experience, my job. In the moment, you're like, yeah, this is great. We should be there. And then, but upon reflection, for me, it's like, I don't know what the fuck we were doing, right? Especially Iraq. I think certainly, Afghanistan, there was certainly need to go into Afghanistan, but, I even go back now and it's like, was Iraq worth it? And Iraq certainly has now started, I think, to stabilize fairly well. And so maybe, another 10, 15 years time will tell if Iraq does become, a no kidding, a viable, you know, society or country, then maybe it was worth it. And then certainly, Afghanistan has its challenges as well. But if you go back and look at, the amount of casualties we had, was it worth it or not? And, did we get the vengeance we needed for 9/11 or not? That's just still probably remains to be seen, right? Because it wasn't a Pearl Harbor, right, where you go and you defeat, the German or the the Japanese, right? And they surrender, and then you won, and you got your victory parades, and same thing with the defeat of the Germans. Like it's just it's a different thing, right? It doesn't have the same feel, right? Even though we had the mission accomplished, we had some parades, it's just not, doesn't feel the same as probably World War II felt, right? So,
what advice do you have to present and future Marines?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's we may or may not be in a combat mindset or combat footing right now. Certainly, there are things on the horizon, right? There's, potential for Taiwan. There's potential for a European conflict. And so I do feel that we are on the cusp of another, something combat related in the very near future. So, for those Marines, whether they're joining the Marines now or they're in the Marines now, it's become the best that you can at your job. And train your Marines, to your left and to your right, to do their jobs, take care of each other, and then when and if the call comes for combat, right? It's have confidence in your duties, right? Everyone is trained for a reason, and they're trained for these moments where the nation calls upon them to do their job. And I will say, and I say it sort of in jest, but especially for officers, even on the enlisted side, is don't be that Marine that just lets loose and cries your heart out because you're scared, right? We're all scared. I guarantee you, in that long line of convoy of cars, lined up to go invade Kuwait or Iraq, I'm sorry, there's a shit ton of Marines in that convoy that were scared, right? We're all scared, but you have to learn to control your emotions, and harness that energy and put it somewhere else and go and do your job.
Vic, do you have any final questions?
I guess just to expound a little bit on that is right now we're sort of in a position in the Marine Corps where so many the combat vets and the experience is either at a rank where they don't have a lot of influence on the individual Marines or the more junior Marines who are going to be doing the trigger pulling and the trench digging, or they've just left the service entirely and just aged out. What do you have to say for the young leaders, sort of the middle management, the young NCOs, the lieutenants, the captains, as far as readiness, maintaining those things and not just sort of getting complacent? Because both of us were, pre 9/11 guys, and it was a very different Marine Corps when we were very young, and we, it learned us something real quick. So what would you have to say for those guys? And maybe the cliche of just be ready, you never know, is enough, but do you have something maybe with a little more teeth than that?
You think you already took it from me, right? But it's like we are already trained to do your job, right? So to me, it's train every day like you're going to combat the next day, right? And it's they say complacency kills, and it's like don't get complacent. We say that we constantly train to that standard, but the reason the Marine Corps is so good at their job, and the nation calls on the Marines to go do hard things, is because we train. Right. And we hold ourselves to a standard, and we don't back down, and we don't say no. Right. And so, it's every day, living every day like you're going into combat tomorrow. And that goes just from your day-to-day duties to your combat and your fitness routine. right, is don't get complacent. Train like you're going to combat. So it's running through scenarios with your Marines. It's, and it could be an administrative Marine, right? It could be a mechanic. It could be intel. I mean, you name the MOS. Every single one of those is critical to combat operations. And so, especially on the officer and the leadership side, is your day will come. Yeah, you may not, you may not see it, you may not have all the chest candy and all that stuff, but you know what? Your day will come where you will get an opportunity to lead Marines in a combat situation, whether you like it or not. And just when you get in that situation, all eyes are on you to do what you're trained to do and go out and accomplish your mission.